You are listening to the Stoic Solutions Podcast, practical wisdom for everyday life. I'm your host, Justin Vacula. This is episode 71 with special guest Cathy Young. We talk about free speech, the injustice taking place in left-leaning social justice circles, authoritarianism on the right, civility, responsible use of social media, political divisions, the danger of identity politics, and the intellectual dark web. She also questions popular movements, including feminism and Black Lives Matter, highlighting many flaws where activism and ideology go wrong. Visit my website at stoicsolutionspodcast.com, where you can connect with me on social media, find past episodes, and join my Discord chat server for interactive discussion. Support my work by becoming a donor through Patreon or PayPal to receive special perks, using referral links in the Donate tab on my website, and sharing my content. Email me with your thoughts, justinvacula@gmail.com. Thanks for your support. Cathy Young is a columnist for the Boston Globe and Reason, an author and a public speaker. Since September of 2000, Young has been a regular op-ed columnist for the Boston Globe. She also writes a monthly column for Reason magazine. From 1993 to 1999, she was a weekly columnist for the Detroit News. Her columns, book reviews, and feature articles have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Newsday, the American Spectator, Salon.com, National Review, and the New Republic. Cathy was very generous with her time today, as we had quite a lengthy discussion. Here it is. All right. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Today we'll talk about the topic of justice, particularly injustice, that you've seen within left-leaning circles, often trumpeting what they view as social justice. You know a worrying trend attacking Enlightenment values in a piece that you wrote for Forward titled The Left-Wing Threat to Liberalism.
Right. Well, what I was specifically interested in dealing with, and I've written on this issue a number of times, is that there's been a lot of discussion recently of liberalism in danger from a rising authoritarian populist trend on the right. And I think that those concerns are entirely valid. I certainly share them. But I think a lot of the time when this issue is discussed, there is a lack of attention to the fact that there is a kind of parallel authoritarian and illiberal trend on the left. I think it's been getting more attention in the years since I've written about it, but even so, I think a lot of the time when people talk about the defense of liberal values, we really have to look at the fact that both in the United States and in Europe, for instance, and especially in Europe, we now have a lot of speech regulation on the grounds of preventing hate speech. There have been some shocking cases, for instance, in England, where you may have heard of the case of a so-called Count Dankula, who's a podcaster, or a YouTuber, who was actually prosecuted for what was really essentially a stupid joke. He apparently taught his girlfriend's dog to do a sort of Nazi salute. It was not meant as an endorsement of Nazi ideas. It was actually meant as, oh, look, but my girlfriend really loves this dog, and I'm going to teach it to do like the most obnoxious thing that it could possibly do. So, really, it was based on the assumption, the humor was in the, was rooted in the assumption that, Nazis are bad, essentially. So really, you could argue that it's a really tacky joke. It's not really up there with, let's say, Mel Brooks making fun of the Nazis and the producers. Okay, but, are we going to say that, humor about the Nazis is permissible, only if it's at a really high level of, brilliance and and creativity and so on. No, I think that would be kind of ridiculous. And this guy was actually prosecuted for hate speech, and he was sentenced to pay a fine. I forget the amount. And he can afford it because, he's a guy who apparently has a pretty good revenue on YouTube.
Sure.
On the other hand, if you think about it, somebody who doesn't have a lot of money, for them, this could really be a very significant deterrent. There have been other cases also in England where people have been visited by the police to talk about, possible hate crimes because they shared something on the internet that was regarded as offensive to transgender people, like a meme that said women don't have penises. And, this is kind of insane. This is, if you think about, what message are we conveying about what a liberal society is? Because,
Right.
if this is the modern liberal society, I can understand a lot of people saying, well, you know what, it's actually not free and it's not diverse. It's not intellectually pluralist.
Sure.
So I think that the speech issues are certainly one thing. Now, in the United States, thankfully, we have the First Amendment, which really makes it impossible to have these types of prosecutions. But, if we look at the backlash that people have received in the social media, if we look at threats to people's careers for supposedly unacceptable speech, I think we definitely have good cause to be concerned. And,
Right.
it gets complicated because when people talk about Twitter mobs, somebody always responds, well, people who want to criticize certain ideas, what about their freedom of speech? And, you can't really tell them not to criticize something that they consider to be bigoted. And sure thing, it does get complicated. But I think when you get situations where people's livelihood is threatened, where people's employers are contacted to, inform them that one of their employees is, supposedly expressing bigoted ideas in the social media. And it really can be about nothing more than a disagreement. So I think that there really are, even in the United States, I think there is actual cause to be concerned about free speech in some of these contexts. It may not necessarily be a First Amendment issue because the First Amendment does only apply to the government. But at the same time, I think that it is important to have strong cultural values favoring free speech.
Right.
Because I think that without those values, the First Amendment may technically be respected, but you don't really have a free society, unless you have values that protect speech. I mean, I think we can all agree that, for instance, when somebody could be fired from their job for coming out as gay, or for expressing, an opinion favorable to gay rights. I think we can all agree that that was repressive, even if the government wasn't involved, that was a real, restriction on human rights. But, we really do have to consider, what sort of situation do we have today where, for instance, somebody's employment may be threatened because they don't agree with same-sex marriage. I think most of us believe that, it is definitely a good thing that we have equal marriage rights, that this is, this represents very real progress. But at the same time, I think we do have to understand that in a free and diverse society, people will have different values based on religion, based on culture. I think we certainly have every right to try to persuade them that they're wrong, but when you do create a situation where people can be fired over this, I think this raises very real questions of, what does this really mean for freedom as a cultural value? And, a lot of the time it's not even that clear cut. I mean, people have been accused of homophobia for things that are, not nearly as clear as, let's say, saying, I really don't think gay marriage should be legal. I mean, people have been, there was another situation that I wrote about for the Forward in which an adult film star was really kind of driven to suicide by social media harassment because she expressed a concern about performing with male adult actors who had done same-sex scenes because she had concerns about screening for HIV. Mm-hmm. And this position was denounced as being homophobic. She got some really horrible abuse, and she eventually committed suicide. Well, we don't know for a fact whether that was related to this harassment that she got. But, I do think it's interesting that most of the time when people talk about, when the mainstream media, for instance, talk about internet harassment, we hear a great deal about women who are harassed by, misogynist trolls. Right. That seems to be the kind of, and it's interesting because if every study that you look at actually shows that, generally speaking, except for a small subset where, young women tend to be sexually harassed more than young men, which, unfortunately is not surprising. But other than that one fairly narrow category of, I think, like women under 25, and specifically sexual harassment. Men really get, like every other type of harassment, men tend to get more of. Men get more death threats. I mean, there's this idea, which is really bizarre, that women, a woman cannot go on the internet without being, bombarded with, obscene photos and being, bombarded with rape threats and death threats. And, again, you look at actual surveys, you look at actual studies, and generally speaking, it's men who get more death threats, even with something like revenge porn, where people get, explicit photos of themselves or videos getting posted online without their consent. Mm-hmm. You actually have slightly more men reporting that this happened to them. Right. So, there is this really serious misconception. But the other thing that really interests me is that in this whole conversation about internet harassment, which has been the subject of hearings at the United Nations, hearings in Congress, there's pending legislation. One type of harassment that gets completely ignored is the sort of call-out culture, harassment by denouncing somebody as a bigot, denouncing somebody as a, transphobe, a homophobe. Joss Whedon at one point got kind of driven off Twitter when he posted this sort of lighthearted joke where somebody was, I think he was talking about like stupid questions that he gets about how to write a strong female character. And he wrote this, the point that he was trying to make basically is that, you just basically take a strong character that happens to be female, right? Mm-hmm. And he said something like, she must be strong and compassionate and not have penis and balls, or something like that.
So the transphobia allegations.
Immediately, like, he was mobbed by people who were saying things like, you should get your ass kicked, you should get your teeth bashed in because, I have a penis and balls and I am as much of a woman as, anybody else. And it was just this crazy scene where he, I think for 2 days, like he was getting a deluge of hate messages. And I think shortly after, and then I think he also got kind of caught up in another situation where people claimed that there was a rape joke in, I think it was the Age of Ultron, where there was a joke about, the droit de seigneur, the feudal lord's right to, sleep with the bride on her wedding night. And there was a joke about that in the movie, and that was deemed to be a rape joke. And then, of course, people also kind of, remembered the other issue where they said, and you remember when Joss Whedon also made this incredibly transphobic joke about, writing female characters. He was bashed for like a couple of days. Or more, and eventually he decided to leave Twitter. Now, he did sort of say, no, nobody drove me off Twitter. I just, it's consuming too much of my time. But, when you have this situation where somebody gets, really does get bombarded with incredibly nasty stuff, including physical threats, which are really, no one takes these Twitter threats seriously for the most part. But even so, I mean, I'm sure it's pretty unpleasant to, have a lot of people tell you that you should, die in a gruesome way.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting that somehow this type of harassment does not get any attention at all in discussions of harassment on the internet. And there have actually been, at least in addition to the suicide that I mentioned of the adult film star, there was also a case in which a young woman who was a fandom artist attempted suicide when she was denounced as bigoted because, supposedly some of her art was quote unquote problematic. Supposedly this was in the Steven Universe fandom, which I know nothing about.
Nothing is safe.
So yeah, but apparently, there was a character that she drew who is fat on the show, and apparently she drew this character as thinner than she is on the show, and this was considered to be fat phobic, and there was other stuff like that. It was just incredibly stupid stuff. But apparently there was this young woman had a Tumblr blog, and there were dozens of other Tumblr accounts that were essentially policing her full time, and who kept looking for problematic things to quote unquote call out in her work. And eventually this just got so depressing to her that she, this is an 18-year-old, young woman who is almost a teenager really, and who eventually did attempt suicide and ended up in a hospital because of a suicide attempt. So there have been, there are several known cases of either suicides or attempted suicides over this sort of call out culture type of harassment. And yet, in all of these discussions of internet harassment, we hear nothing about this whatsoever. So I just find that really interesting.
Good. That's a good introduction there. We see that people jump to judgment really quickly. They're not so charitable with their interpretations, and it's almost as if they're looking to identify all of these terrible things by just going from 0 to 60 so fast.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? They're not really being fair to their opponents or even having a discussion, but rather they're the enemy. There's the vitriol, as you mentioned, the nastiness, rather than actually trying to have a conversation or just ignoring it, right? Right. They get so offended. They feel that it's their moral obligation or duty to respond with backlash. And often it's that they want fairness. They want justice. They say they want to be treated with respect, but they're so disrespectful and intolerant toward others. That I see as a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's also interesting on the Stoic view, it's not something to be offended. We might hear a remark we don't like or come across a person who presents us with some sort of difficulty, but we can work to avoid that and not let others drag us down and bring us to a state of anger or rage in which we really compromise our moral character and treat others poorly.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that interaction on the internet can be sort of complicated because you don't, see people face to face. You don't hear the tone of voice. You don't often. I mean, I've had experiences where somebody totally missed the fact that I was being sarcastic about something and, somebody took offense. I had an experience just the other day where somebody made a comment in a tweet, responding to something I said that I thought, sounded like a personal insult that was directed at me. And I was kind of taken aback. But, instead of jumping down this person's throat, I just said, I'm sorry, could you clarify this? Is this directed to me? And he said, oh, no. I was just making a theoretical point about it. It was something about, people being mean-spirited and so on. And no, apparently it was not directed at me at all. It was just sort of a general point that was in response to a tweet of mine. So, and I think really if more people did that, if more people didn't immediately jump to the least charitable conclusion, I think that would certainly improve the internet experience for all of us. And, I'm seeing a lot of people, in this, because right now we have the sort of the social justice community, and we also have the sort of anti-SJW, the anti-social justice warrior kind of corner of Twitter. And it's kind of funny that a lot of the time the same people who will, gleefully discuss how easily triggered, the social justice people are. A lot of the time, they show the exact same tendencies. Like when somebody says something that they find offensive, or, somebody criticizes, their favorite podcaster or whatever, suddenly they will be, extremely thin-skinned and extremely, willing to jump down people's throats. So I think whatever community you belong to, and I think people kind of invariably sort themselves into, groups and kind of tribes, whether it's on Twitter or any place else. And, that's fine. I mean, people have their social circle, and, people have their circle of friends. But I think you really have to watch out for kind of knee-jerk tribalism. And, you don't always assume that somebody who's in your camp is right about everything. And, you don't jump on somebody for saying something supposedly offensive without, making some kind of effort to find out, whether you're misunderstanding them, whether you're kind of making a mountain out of a molehill. And, we're all human, we're all imperfect, but I think we certainly could do a better job of interacting on Twitter than we're doing now. Because, I have been seeing a lot of people recently saying that it's just, getting too much for them. And, a number of people have been leaving because they just find the atmosphere too hostile, which is a shame because, of course, obviously the more, good people leave, the worse the climate becomes. So it's kind of a, vicious circle.
Right. And there's a call for moderation, as that's a central virtue in Stoic discussion, that, well, if we have too much social media, of course, they weren't talking about social media in ancient times, but too much of anything can be really bad. So we can question technology. How are we to use it? How are we to do it well? That if we use it in a good manner, then it could enhance our lives. But if we use it in a poor manner, of course, it can really drag us down, as people can be harmed by that.
Right. Part of the problem is that I think we're really just still learning our way around the social media. We do have this remarkable situation today where, we can have a conversation with people who are thousands of miles away. We can have a circle of friends that includes, people from Australia and, from, from all over the world, really. And there is this interaction where it feels very intimate. It feels very personal. It feels like our sort of little village. But at the same time, it includes people with extremely different experiences, with extremely different, mental habits and so on. And, another thing that I think is kind of difficult for people to get used to, I think, is that, in the past, when you interacted with people, a lot of the time you didn't know anything about their politics. Like, people generally kind of even tended to avoid political conversations at work, for instance, because it tends to be polarizing, unless you know that the person is on the same page as you are. And, it's not just politics in the electoral sense. It's opinions about all sorts of, divisive social and political issues. And, you might know somebody for a while. You might have people in your own family and, have no idea what they think about, let's say, abortion or, what they think about, the war on drugs or, illegal immigration. Today, a lot of time, people express those opinions on Facebook or on Twitter. And then, people get upset. People, you have people within the same family, within close family circles not talking to each other because it's like, oh my God, my uncle posted this really horrible thing on Facebook, embarrassed to be related to him because I think in a way we kind of know too much about each other, maybe, these days because, we all kind of live in the social media fishbowl. What you put into that fishbowl really is entirely up to you. You don't have to talk about politics necessarily. You don't have to chronicle all the details of your personal life as some people do. But, if you do that, it's probably going to create some problem. So I think we're still getting used to that. I don't really, there is this very apocalyptic view of, social media platforms and, like this is, welcome to hell, basically, like we're all caught in this, inferno we're all making and we'll never get out. I think that there's always been a tendency to kind of see doom in, new ways of interaction. There have been a lot of changes that have transformed the society in really radical ways. I'm not sure. Right. Facebook is necessarily more radical than, the printing press, other things that have happened in history. So, I think certainly the exchange of information today happens much faster than it used to in the past. On the other hand, you read today about virtue signaling mobs that got whipped up by the tabloids in the 1930s. It didn't take quite as little time. Obviously, there had to be a certain amount of time that had to elapse before a story could run in a newspaper. On the other hand, you usually had 2 or 3 editions a day. So there were sort of like social media updates, you could say. I don't know that it was really all that different in essence. I guess you could argue that sometimes, the speed of information qualitatively changes things, but I don't know. I'm not so sure. I think that, to paraphrase Shakespeare, the fault lies not in our social media, but in ourselves,
The fake quote there. Oh, yeah. How are we going to use the social media and how can we learn to communicate well is an interesting question. And now we can realize, as the Stoics talk about, well, we're a global community of people. We have a lot of things in common with one another and maybe more things in common than are different. And we can question how to get along with others, how to exist in a world where there are people who disagree with us on matters that we find important. How can we be civil towards others? How can we better understand people if we're going to simply shout people down, no platform them, and just cast off all who disagree as gender traitors or sexist or misogynist or whatever? That's not going to be helpful. We could avoid certain people, as there are some legitimate cases, and many, to be sure, of people who are quite disreputable, but
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think even more perniciously, a lot of the time the labeling and the attacks are not even based on ideas or opinion. Just seems so ubiquitous in the last, I would say, 2 or 3 years. Putting somebody down by, calling them a white male or, an old white male, you're an old white guy or, you're a white lady. And so the white lady the old white lady is going to tell me about, these issues of interest to Black people, and it really become this extremely common means of dismissing people not just in social media conversations, but in the professional media as well. The left of center media in the last several years, I think, have come to be really dominated by people who embrace this sort of the intersectional social justice viewpoint. And one of its characteristics, and this really goes back to what I was talking about before, about the sort of illiberal leftism, is classifying people by race, gender, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and other characteristics, rather than, by their, qualities or opinions or whatever. This is it's interesting because there's been a lot of discussion about identity politics. And I think a lot of the time people who purport to defend identity politics really employ this extremely broad definition that I think is kind of meaningless, where they say, so you're against identity politics. So, that means, for instance, that we shouldn't talk about racism in law enforcement because that's specific to African Americans primarily. And so because that's an identity-related issue, we shouldn't talk about it. Or if there's a type of injustice that affects primarily women, so we shouldn't talk about it because that's identity politics. I don't think anyone has ever said that any issue that is unique or particular or, primary to a specific group is necessarily identity politics. I don't think anyone would say that the fight against segregation in the 1950s and 1960s was about identity politics because, it affected primarily Black people. I think the real issue is not whether the issues you address are more specific to some groups than to others, but whether you classify people by their identity. I think that is primarily what people mean by identity politics. Martin Luther King had a lot of criticism of, the people that he called the white moderates, who were basically like people who took the view that, of course we're in favor of racial justice, but you really shouldn't be quite so pushy about it. And we really should allow more time for change to happen. He had a lot of criticism of those people, quite rightly, essentially saying that, look, we have people who are being affected by these injustices today. You're really not helping by taking this position. But I don't recall Martin Luther King ever saying, you're white, so shut up about that. You're
right. Yeah, they'll say you don't know what it's like. You can't have a voice on this. And okay, well, maybe I don't know what it's like, but can I be an ally? Can you tell me more information? Can we work together? Right.
Obviously, no white person living in the 1950s had the experience of, having to pee on the side of the road because no bathroom would allow you to go in, because you couldn't find a bathroom because, obviously not only were the facilities segregated, but a lot of the time, like a gas station would only have facilities for white. So, certainly you didn't have the experience. You didn't have the experience of having to tell your kids that, we can't go to Disneyland today because, this is a day when they don't admit any colored people. But I would think that what people like Martin Luther King relied on is that anyone has the ability to understand that. And, the ability to, listen to somebody who tells you about that experience. And you don't really need to have had it yourself to understand that it's really horrible. Imagine what it would be like if you had to take your kids all the way to Disneyland. And when you got there, you were told that you can't go in because of the color of your skin. I mean, you don't really need to experience that firsthand or to be in a position to experience that to understand that this is not the way a decent society should treat its people. And I think that was the message that Martin Luther King relied on. It was certainly not, just, shut up and, don't presume to be a part of the conversation. So I think that's the real difference. The difference is not, whether you raise issues that are specific to people of a certain identity, but it's whether you judge people by that identity. And, that I think is the real problem. And of course, the other thing is that a lot of the issues that are being discussed today, a lot of the issues that are related to sort of social justice broadly defined, are issues where we don't necessarily have all the answers. They're really not settled issue. I mean, I think with segregation, for instance, it was really, basically all that needed to be done is for the real kind of the reality of segregation to be conveyed and brought to, American society at large. And I think, there was massive support for the civil rights movement. I mean, eventually it kind of got more complicated because when Martin Luther King spoke out against the war in Vietnam and, he started addressing some of the, issues related to poverty and, it kind of got more complicated. People started calling him a communist. And at one point, his poll numbers actually did, before he was assassinated, his poll numbers did decline dramatically. But initially, there was really very, very widespread support for the movement against segregation. And I think, once people saw on their TV screens, what was happening with the peaceful demonstrators being essentially, assaulted with dogs and water hoses. So I think in that case, there really was a pretty simple answer, which was to, abolish the system of legal segregation. In that sense, I mean, obviously there were were more complicated issues when it came to, schools that were de facto segregated because of residential patterns, and when you started dealing with issues like, children being bused to other neighborhoods, where, I'm not going to say that was all, extremely simple and, easily solved. Obviously, there were some very contentious and complicated issues. But I think today, a lot of the issues we're talking about, issues related to, the Me Too movement and sexual assault. I mean, there are legitimate arguments. I mean, nobody is for sexual assault, but there are actual arguments, first of all, about, what constitutes sexual assault in this day and age. There are a lot of discussions of, what is consent. Things that we once thought were really simple, and I think certainly we can agree that, in past generations, a lot of the time, there were things that were kind of taken for granted that, thankfully we don't take for granted anymore. Female office workers were kind of treated as, sort of decorative sex objects, and I think we can all be glad that that is no longer the case for the most part. And, we no longer believe that a powerful Hollywood producer has the right to treat, young female actresses as sort of his personal harem. I think that these are all, issues that we can agree on. But, at the same time, there is such a thing as consensual sexual interaction in the workplace, whether it consists of, sexual banter and sexual humor, which a lot of people, men and women, find to be enjoyable. A lot of feminists say, it really has no place on The Office. So, I mean, I think there are real and, valid disagreements on that. When we look at issues like, the rights of transgender people, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think most of us, again, most decent people will agree that, it is a good thing that we have more recognition and more acceptance of, the rights of transgender people as, equal to anyone else. At the same time, there are very, very complicated issues surrounding gender transition for young children, where we have issues where, we have cases where kids who are not old enough to drink, who are not old enough to get married, who are not old enough to get really any kind of major medical procedure without parental consent. There is a lot of pressure on the parents to allow them to, get hormones to get puberty blockers, to get, hormone treatments. There appears to be a lot of evidence that, many of those kids, many kids who identify as transgender at one point, during early adolescence, eventually change their mind about it and eventually realize that, what they really are is gay. I mean, that's primarily what it is, apparently. A lot of this sort of confusion about gender dysphoria actually has to do with gay kids who, because they are somewhat different from their same-sex peers generally, they start to think, in this climate when there is a lot of supportiveness right now for, being transgender in certain school settings and certain, social, progressive social circles. So, I think that's a legitimate question. I think, there are a lot of feminists who, have, who believe that, women are being sort of in many ways kind of endangered, for instance, by, what happens when somebody who is, biologically male is allowed into a women's jail, when they're an inmate, or, into a women's homeless shelter. These are valid issues. I mean, these things that we can not just say, oh, well, we're not going to talk about this because it's bigoted against transgender people. What happens when you have, trans people in women's sports, who are, who have the advantage of having this sort of biologically male body with all the, I mean, I think that there are valid issues. You can't really just say, oh, because this is, this debate is inherently bigoted, and so we're not going to have it. And anyone who even brings up those issues needs to be deplatformed. I mean, are there feminists who have used incredibly hateful language toward transgender people? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a subset of radical feminists who really kind of hate anyone who is biologically male, whether they're, cisgender or whether they're cisgender males or, biological males who identify as women. And, I think that there is a kind of subset of radical feminism that's incredibly paranoid about this, and they see this as some sort of, evil, infiltration of womanhood by males. I mean, that's crazy, And, so I think there is this subset that is, that really is kind of incredibly hateful and bigoted. Absolutely. But you also have people who really are raising legitimate and valid issues. And I think to try to shut them up, as, has often happened, my last column in Newsday, where I write a weekly column, this is the Long Island local paper, was about a study by Lisa Littman, who is a Brown University researcher. This is a study of kids with gender dysphoria, kids, primarily girls, who all of a sudden, with really no advanced sort of signs of any kind of dissatisfaction with their gender, like suddenly after being exposed to kind of very pro-transgender messages in the social media, maybe, in their circle of friends, suddenly they decide that they're transgender and they start demanding, to change their pronouns, change their name. And a lot of the time they insist on medical treatments that can be really quite hazardous. And those effects we don't really yet fully understand. And, there have been cases where later on, when somebody who's had those treatments changes their mind and kind of detransitions, sometimes their fertility is irreparably damaged. Sometimes, they've had a change of voice. Sometimes they have to, like the young women have to kind of deal with really, severe facial hair for the rest of their lives. So, these are not trifling things. These are things that actually have consequences. And so, I think that these are real issues. And I think, again, this goes to what I was talking about before, this sort of the illiberal leftism that says, no, you cannot talk about these issues because it makes certain people feel, unsafe. And we have this conflation of words and violence where we have these, where we have this whole kind of concept of verbal violence, by which, what it means is not violent threats, because I think most of us would recognize that, of course, if you threaten to kill somebody, that is an actual crime. There is a crime of making terroristic threats. So, we're not saying that there is no such thing as, violent verbal behavior. But at the same time, what the social justice types are really saying is that if you express a supposedly hurtful opinion about transgender issues, you have committed discursive violence. And, if you've published a paper expressing those ideas, you're going to have people clamoring for it to be taken down. It's causing harm to transgender people. So, I think that it's very, very misguided. And it's, and it's very difficult to make the argument that we should be defending, liberal values and Enlightenment values against the sort of right-wing, Trumpian populism, when within the liberal establishment, we have these deeply illiberal trends that really threaten kind of Enlightenment values-based liberalism from within. And we didn't even get to the part about the sort of overt attacks on the Enlightenment, which is a whole, we could talk about that. Because there's also this, and again, none of this is entirely new. This has been going on for some time, right? But there is this increased tendency in the last several years of denouncing the Enlightenment as sexist, racist, imperialist, etc. And I think, no one would dispute that. Of course, people who lived in the 18th century had a lot, did not have modern ideas about race and gender. Most of them did not regard, women as equals, although there actually was if you look at the actual record of the Enlightenment, this is when you get, Mary Wollstonecraft, who is really the first person in the West, pretty much, to formulate a kind of overtly feminist ideas and to actually say that, women should have the same rights as men. Olympe de Gouges in France, making the case for the rights of the female citizen during the French Revolution. These are all people who are coming out of the Enlightenment tradition. There were also, this is when, during the Enlightenment, yes, of course, you can find really racist passages in Kant, you can find racist passages in Voltaire, but at the same time, the Enlightenment is when you find people starting to make the case for abolition of slavery. This argument that there is an argument that the Enlightenment kind of made things worse by spearheading scientific racism. And there is a certain subset of Enlightenment era thought that really began this kind of pseudoscientific argument for, the races being kind of distinct species and so on and so forth. But, I don't think it's the Enlightenment itself that is the place. The thing about the Enlightenment is that this was really the rise of scientific thought, as such. So, of course, the racist prejudices that already existed sometimes started getting couched in scientific terms because people were kind of trying to find scientific frameworks for everything. And, that included racial prejudice. That doesn't mean that racial prejudice didn't exist before. If you look at Othello, for instance, which was written in 1605, I think, you have a huge amount of, racial prejudice being expressed right there, where, clearly, most of the characters see Othello as inferior because he's black. And that's just a reality, unfortunately. And the fact that some of this thinking got a kind of pseudoscientific veneer during the Enlightenment doesn't mean that the Enlightenment itself was responsible for the racism. If anything, I think you really can. The Enlightenment is also really the origin of a lot of sort of interest in other cultures. There was a huge kind of upsurge of interest at the time in Europe, in Muslim culture, in Chinese culture, and of course, there were a lot of misconceptions about both, and there was a certain amount of exoticized thinking, but there was also a genuine interest in studying the values of other cultures and taking them seriously, and not just treating people from other civilizations as these unchristian heathens whose only purpose really was to be converted into Christianity. So yeah, I think it's a really unfortunate caricature of the Enlightenment. I think the Enlightenment certainly had many different facets, not all of which were benevolent. That is very true. You can find a lot of different intellectual strands during the Enlightenment, but that doesn't really invalidate the fact that this is also when you have the origins of, the belief in intellectual freedom, the belief in human equality, the belief in, individual human dignity. So just seems to me that the attacks on the Enlightenment are tremendously misguided. And I think that if you're going to say that, we need to defend liberal values against the sort of onslaught on the far right, which represents some incredibly ugly ideologies, it's really kind of not very wise at this time when these values are already under threat to say and by the way, those values that we're all supposed to defend, they're really rooted in, racist, sexist, imperialistic thinking that is actually kind of profoundly evil. So, it's, that is just really, really unwise.
Good. So we should have an attitude of humility and think, well, maybe we don't have all the answers or the solutions, or maybe our conceptualization of these issues is off, and that the issues are very complex, that just a simple solution, a simple answer isn't going to be the cure-all here, and that people will propose some radical economic solutions, or we need to say, oh, all these people need to be out of power and they just need to be replaced with women because that's equality. Is that really the way to go forward? If we can give people opportunities, if we can go in all sorts of different directions. And even then, okay, well, people have the freedom to apply for a certain job, but it doesn't mean they're interested. It doesn't mean they're going to take it. But you question these things, you propose some of these solutions, and you've become the enemy, right? Stoics call us to question the wisdom of the crowds. And if you question things like the gender wage gap, rape culture, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, then you're just public enemy here.
Yeah, just give you another example that I think is interesting. Like one area where I've seen people defend identity politics is, you just mentioned Black Lives Matter, so I'll comment on that. I've seen a number of people, and not just on the left, I've seen sort of there's a subset of libertarians that is quite sympathetic to sort of social justice concerns. And, again, I'm kind of interrupting myself. When you define something as social justice, well, who wants to be against it, right? I mean, it's kind of...
People see it as this great thing, right?
Yeah, and I mean, people will say like, "Oh, well, what do you mean? Like you're against the social justice movement? Does that mean that you're for social injustice?" Yeah, well, I'm also against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That doesn't mean I'm against democracy, But yeah, that's so I've seen the argument that, well, if you want to talk about criticizing identity politics, Black Lives Matter is this incredibly important movement which has brought attention to the very real issue of the abuse of police authority, to police brutality, and so on. And that's a kind of identity-based movement. And what I would argue is I actually think that most likely a kind of less explicitly race-oriented movement against police brutality probably would have been more successful. And I don't think that's because, people don't take Black lives seriously enough and so on. I really don't think that that's true of most people. But, the thing is that, I mean, yes, on the one hand, there is a lot of evidence that there is fairly widespread kind of racial prejudice when it comes to crime. I mean, there is a tendency to perceive young black males in particular as, more criminal. And I mean, some of that is associated with, the demographic fact that people in that group really are more likely to commit crimes. On the other hand, there is also no question that they are treated differently. They're more likely to be treated as suspect, even when they're likely to be profiled in all sorts of ways, whether it's being stopped in the street and, being randomly searched and, things like stop and frisk, which New York used to have before it got suspended on grounds of racial profiling, whether it's getting longer sentences for the same crimes. So there is a lot of that going on, and I think that's a very real concern. On the other hand, I think when it comes to like police brutality per se and to police shootings, in spite of the fact that there has been a huge amount of attention drawn to a number of incidents in which unarmed black men were shot and killed by the police. When you look at the actual studies, it actually doesn't seem to be the case that, if you look at black people as a proportion of all police interactions, it actually doesn't seem to be the case that they're more likely than white people to be shot during those interactions. It's complicated because it's disproportionate in relation to the population. But if you look at, again, like the percentage of police interactions, there are some studies that actually show that, again, like if you look at the overall number of suspects, like people who get arrested, black people may actually be slightly less likely, like black suspects than white suspects to be shot. They're more likely to experience other kinds of violence, like being thrown to the ground, being pushed against the wall. So yeah, I mean, the bias certainly does exist, but not necessarily in the area of shootings per se. And there have been a number of really outrageous incidents involving white people who were shot by the police, due to some sort of mistake, due to the police officer just overreacting to a perceived threat. So, this is definitely not something that is solely a racial issue. And I think to cast it as such is really kind of needlessly polarizing, but it also, I think, kind of leaves out a number of people who would share those concerns, if it wasn't defined solely in racial terms. I mean, what if you're going to make the case that, police procedures in America tend to be designed in such a way that they often lead to unnecessary shootings? Do you think it's more productive to say, well, and this only happens to Black people? Or do you think it's more productive to say, and this could happen to anyone, including you? I mean, there have been, certainly it's less likely, but there have been cases of, middle-class white people who get shot because, they didn't precisely obey a police instruction in a really tense situation. Black Lives Matter is an organization that has all sorts of, political positions that may not even necessarily, have to do with police brutality. I mean, their platform has a, pro-Palestinian.
Right. There's also talk of reparations as well, of economic.
Palestinian liberation plank. So yeah, I mean, I think that you can certainly, have a lot of issues with specific things about the platform and the viewpoints of Black Lives Matter. It's not, either you're a supporter of Black Lives Matter or you're, because I actually have people being accused of racism merely for saying, well, I'm not really a great fan of Black Lives Matter. And, oh, well, then obviously, you think that Black lives don't matter. Well, no.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. It's questioning a movement and the tactics that they use, not individuals, not people, not an identity.
Right, of course. And I think, it's kind of like saying that if you question feminism in its modern form, you're anti-woman. Mm-hmm. That's, of course, we hear that a lot. I mean, I've heard that a lot. I mean, if you're a guy, that makes you a misogynist. If a woman, that makes you a self-hating female.
Internalized misogyny, yeah.
Internalized misogyny, right. I've heard that one a lot. So, yeah, but, we could probably do another hour about just feminism, so...
Sure. And you talk about identity politics hurting, and it's interesting. Many have theorized that the rise of identity politics and social justice circles led to the election of Trump. Surely not the only factor, but something many commentators have pointed as leading to that victory.
Right. And I think, I think that we don't know to what extent that is true. It's something that's hard to measure. I believe that there have been actually some polls showing that there's a correlation between, people being concerned with so-called political correctness and voting for Trump. I mean, I personally interviewed, at one point I did a story for Foreign Policy magazine about women in populist movements. And as part of that, I interviewed 7 or 8 women who had voted for Trump. It was interesting that I would say specifically had concerns that I would describe as, concerns with identity politics and so-called political correctness. One of them was a woman whose son had been accused of sexual assault and was eventually cleared, but not before a really protracted and kind of agonizing, Title IX, kind of kangaroo court on a college campus. And she was very concerned about the situation with Title IX. It's kind of interesting that this is one area in which, as much as I loathe the Trump administration, I actually think that what Betsy DeVos has done in Title IX is a good thing. I mean, this is something that liberals should be supportive of. This is more, this is a kind of pro-rights of defendants. And it's really dispiriting to see liberals being kind of up in arms about it. This is a very, very clear example of kind of identity politics in action, where because it's supposed to be about, women's rights, even though actually there have been cases of women who have been accused and kind of railroaded under Title IX. But yeah, it's just this incredible thing where, we have these campus disciplinary proceedings that really not only can end your college career, but can pretty much label you a criminal, label you a rapist, more or less, with none of the protections that you have in criminal court, where really the duck is very heavily stacked against you. And, and I think that Betsy DeVos really actually does deserve credit for seeking to change the situation and to make the rules a little more equitable. So, yeah, I think that is one area. I also spoke to a young woman who is a college student, and it's kind of an interesting situation because I was directed to this young woman by her mother, who I know who voted for Hillary Clinton and who was really completely dismayed that her daughter was going to vote for Trump. But, her daughter basically said, she was incredibly fed up with this sort of politically correct setting on campus. And it's funny because she was incredibly, concerned with maintaining her anonymity. And she said, not only can you not mention my name, if people figured out that I voted for Trump, my academic career would be over. And she attends a fairly major school in New York. She said that one of her issues was that there was this endless kind of drumbeat of you need to acknowledge your white privilege and, and so forth. And one thing that she mentioned was that there was a class discussion. I forget which class this was, but there was a mention of some survey which showed that the majority of women in Muslim cultures, or in certain Muslim cultures at least, believed that it was okay for a husband to beat his wife if she disobeyed him. And the professor basically, when some students in the class kind of expressed dismay over that, the professor essentially took the stand that, well, we really shouldn't be judgmental because it's their culture. And, and she just thought that it was incredibly hypocritical, given how much emphasis there normally was on feminism. Suddenly, when we're talking about a quote unquote marginalized population, suddenly, endorsement of wife beating is really something that we shouldn't be judgmental about.
Right. Cultural relativism there. Yeah.
Cultural relativism, right? And she just saw this as part of this whole kind of politically correct, situation. So, yeah, I think there was also some of her concern, I think, was about, gender neutral bathrooms on campus. There was a lot of stuff like that. She was not conservative. She was not, somebody who had reactionary views. She actually, when I spoke to her, it was right after the so-called Muslim ban. And she actually said something like, well, if I had known that Trump was going to do this, I probably wouldn't have voted for him. And, she certainly was not somebody who was generally a supporter of, these types of policies. But it was, as I said, of the, I think I interviewed a total of 8 people, or maybe 9 people. And I think about, 3 of them had concerns that distinctly had to do with so-called political correctness or identity politics. And there have been other examples that people have given where people gave that as their example, as kind of as their reason to vote for Trump. There's also been a lot of concern about, with the rise of the alt-right and the sort of the white nationalist far right. There have been a lot of concerns about people being kind of pushed toward that by identity politics on the left. And, and again, you sort of get the argument, so you became a Nazi because somebody said mean things about white people on the internet. That's ridiculous. And, that probably means that you were already kind of predisposed toward being a Nazi in the first place. Well, I think that's a bit of a character. I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's as simple as Sarah Jones said nasty things about white people, so I'm going to go nationalist. But I think you have to remember that, first of all, a lot of the people who get involved in these movements are very young. They're not sophisticated. Yes. They're not very experienced in, political movements and political issues. What happens a lot of the time, and I've actually seen this happen to people, they get really fed up with a lot of this, this ridiculous, politically correct sort of identity politics stuff that they see, especially on the internet. And of course, a lot of young people, they spend a lot of time on the internet. They may also get fed up with things that happen if they're in college. They may get fed up with freshman orientation where, you have, Inquisition-like sessions where it's step up and tell us about forms of privilege that you enjoy. And obviously, if you're privileged, that means that you have to, feel guilty about it. And you're this evil person who is oppressing women and people of color and so on.
Yeah, a lot of anti-male content in that as well.
Right, a lot of anti-male, a lot of anti-white. So yeah, I think what you have is a number of people who are fed up with that, and they go on the internet, looking for like critiques of social justice. And you have certain, like, there is content that I think sometimes serves unintentionally as a gateway. And especially, for instance, with YouTube, the way that it's the YouTube algorithm works is that if you watch, you could watch a video that is not even necessarily, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the alt-right. You could watch a sort of moderately centrist video that criticizes certain social justice concept. And then what you're going to see in your, related videos is something that is going to lead you further and further down. And I think that is the way a lot of this happens. And I think because a lot of young people, and I think this really does have to do with our educational system not promoting critical thinking. I think a lot of young people, when they discover, for instance, just to give you an example about feminism, I mean, I've seen young women, I've seen videos that have been made by young women who have become these raging anti-feminists. And they say oh, well, I was always taught, this and that. And then I went online and I found out that, it's actually not true what they told me about the gender gap. It's not true what they told me about domestic violence. And then once they realize that kind of misled about some of those things, they become incredibly kind of credulous toward anything that criticizes mainstream feminist concepts. Then, unfortunately, I mean, especially when you have the sort of zeal of the newly converted, you realize that everything you were told and everything you believed until today turned out to be, well, not necessarily a complete lie,
right,
maybe, but, really not accurate. Then you can, you are kind of ripe pickings for recruitment by some pretty extreme people on the other side. Suddenly, and I've seen some of those young women get pulled into fairly extreme ideologies where, suddenly they're oh, well, actually it's women who have always been, parasites and, oh, and actually, well, maybe there are really good reasons that women shouldn't vote. I was no, you really don't want to go down that. So I think the same thing happens, I'm sure, with some of the people who get, the young people who get recruited into white nationalism. One moment you're questioning affirmative action and, you want to learn more about, let's say, discrimination against Asians in college admissions in order to, to get the right kind of proportions of racial diversity. And then, I think it's very easy for people, unfortunately, to get pulled into extreme movements. And, that doesn't justify, I mean, I'm not excusing anyone who becomes a white nationalist or a misogynist. I'm certainly not, making excuses for that. But and I've run into those people. I mean, at one point I wrote a couple of articles that were pretty harshly critical of the alt-right. And I mean, I had to change my settings on Twitter because I was getting about over 100 anti-Semitic messages.
Yeah, Ben Shapiro was another voice that he got a lot of backlash too, and he's obviously on the right.
Yeah, I didn't get it nearly as bad as Ben Shapiro. I mean, he was I think the ADL actually did a study of people getting anti-Semitic messages from the right. I mean, not from the alt-right. And Ben Shapiro was at the top of the list. I mean, I wasn't even in the top 10. So it's funny because, I mean, there is a vast amount of ignorance out there, among people on the kind of the far right. I think there is a segment that is really not willing to even look at it.
Right, but there's some hope going forward in that there are people who are speaking up for a centrist, a more moderate, a more reasonable voice like you and many people on the intellectual dark web, as we've talked about that a little bit. I don't know if you've been named as a member or if you received a special invitation. I'm not sure.
People see me as sort of intellectual dark web adjacent, I guess. I mean, I wrote for Medium, for ArcDigital, which is this Medium magazine that I've actually recently joined as a contributing editor. I did a piece that was quite popular about the intellectual dark web. I mean, I'm concerned about, I mean, I think there is a certain amount of tribalism that exists on the intellectual dark web as well. I mean, I've seen people defend, there's a certain kind of clubby mentality where it's like, if you attack a member of the intellectual dark web, other IDW people will kind of come to their defense, even if, they're being attacked for a very good reason. I'm not a huge fan of clubs and labels. And, I think there are people on the so-called intellectual dark web who I think are very worthwhile. Sam Harris is one that I would certainly name. Christina Hoff Sommers, I think, has been doing some great work.
Right, the Weinsteins.
The Weinsteins, Brett Weinstein and Heather Heng, who I actually interviewed a while back, and I really need to write a feature about them because it's just, there is so much going on right now. It's like I usually have 10 ideas a week, and if I can do 3 of them, that's good. I mean, I think it's a useful concept, maybe, in that I think there is, in the mainstream kind of liberal media and academia today, I think there definitely is a kind of groupthink with, the things that I was talking about, like identity politics being kind of the principal framework for approaching a lot of issues, with the belief that, speech that, is perceived as invalidating someone's identity is a form of violence, the belief that, microaggressions, are, these unintentional verbal slights or perceived slights are a form of oppression. That really speech needs to be very rigorously policed for, anything that could harm or oppress the quote unquote marginalized. Really, you kind of, people are judged on the basis of their place in this hierarchy of oppressions. I think those ideas are very prevalent in contemporary media and academic culture, left of center. And I think the intellectual dark web is a kind of counterculture to that. I think the problem is when it gets too clubby, when it kind of, develops its own tribalism. And I think, you do get certain people on, in the intellectual dark web who have a kind of no enemies on the right mindset, where it's where they're willing to treat some pretty unsavory people on the right as allies because they're, fellow anti-SJWs. Another way in which I think the kind of the social justice kind of speech police is really causing harm to public discourse is that they cheapen words like racist. They cheapen, anyone can get called a racist for saying that it's okay to wear a sombrero on Halloween,
Right, the cultural appropriation, or that prom dress, that was the recent one. I had an episode on that.
Yeah, you can get called a racist for that. You can get called I've been called a rape apologist for, saying that you don't necessarily need verbal consent to, every single act when you're, engaging in sexual foreplay. You don't actually need to ask, excuse me, may I touch your right nipple, whatever.
Right. It's gotten to the part of an Onion article, and South Park satirized it with the whole season with the PC principal and signing the consent forms and all of this, the safe space jokes. Yeah.
So you get called a rape apologist for, or, you can get called a rape apologist for questioning, for saying that, oh, well, actually, false accusations of rape really do exist. And we don't exactly know how common they are, but they're not such a minuscule problem that we don't have to pay any attention to them. We can just go ahead and assume that everyone's guilty, right? From that standpoint, I think the intellectual dark web can be sort of an overly clubby and kind of defensive thing.
Yeah, I even see that in Stoic communities today as, yes, you question this and that idea, or you're bringing other ideas into Stoicism. I generally just talk about a lot of ideas, but I don't even use the label myself. Well, I gain inspiration from a tradition. I identify with some of the authors. I think they have some good ideas, but I'm not saying, oh, everything is definitely something I'm going with, right? We're drawing from all sorts of traditions, and we're revising our ideas as we encounter new people, new ideas, have new experiences.
Right. Yeah, of course. Well, and it's the same with, labels are always kind of problematic. It's funny that problematic is one of those been kind of ruined by.
Yes. Tricky.
Tricky, right? Tricky. You get into the question of labels, and I mean, people keep asking me whether I'm a feminist. If you go by the dictionary definition of, somebody who believes in equality of the sexes, somebody who believes that, women and men should be treated as equals and, should be judged by their merit and not their gender. Absolutely, I'm a feminist. I mean, do I believe that, women have been denied equal opportunity in many areas? Of course. I think that's kind of self-evident.
What do you mean by that? That's the question.
On the other hand, if you want to look at a lot of what goes into the concept of feminism today, I mean, do I believe that America in 2018 is a patriarchy? No, I don't. I think that there are areas of gender bias that apply to women. There are areas of gender bias that apply to men. I mean, I think that today we should be able to look at both. I think that each sex has distinct advantages and disadvantages, some of which may be innate, some of which may be social. I think the important thing is to treat everyone as an individual, which again doesn't mean that you can't look at certain patterns that primarily affect women or primarily affect men. But again, I mean, does that make me a feminist? Does that make me an egalitarian? I honestly have no idea. I think ideas really should be more important than labels. And with regard to the intellectual dark web, I suppose I'm a kind of sympathetic who is also sometimes a critic. So I'm interested to see where it goes next. I know that there's supposed to be this series of debates in the fall, this Pangborn program, which I don't know. And they seem to charge a massive amount of money. So, they have like really expensive tickets. So
lots of privilege in the room.
Lots of privilege in the room. I mean, I'm hoping to attend some of those. I mean, I'm going to try to use my media privilege of, get passes, but we'll see if that works.
Any final words for listeners? Some positives, some ways forward?
Positive. Okay. Well, I often say that after November 2016, I'm out of the prediction business because, I said, like, my mom, who just really detests Donald Trump, my mom kept asking me, he can't possibly win, can he? And I was, no, of course he's not going to win. It's ridiculous. No, that's just not going to happen. And it's not that my mom was such a big Hillary Clinton fan, but, she just really hates Trump. So ever since then, I have given up on forecasting. However, I think the bad thing, I guess, is that the culture as we know it has kind of been smashed to smithereens, basically. So I think, a lot of the standards that we have been used to really no longer exist. I mean, I think that's the bad news, but in a way, that's also the good news. I think we're kind of almost starting with a blank slate, so to speak, to use a loaded term.
Steven Pinker's in the IDW as well, huh?
Sort of, yeah. Or I guess he's another adjacent, maybe. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of room right now for new and creative ideas, which means that, a lot of those ideas are going to be bad, and I think there's also room, I think, for some bold and unorthodox thinking that could also, lead us to something good. So I think that's the most optimistic thing I can say. I think we have a lot of ideas that we're going to have to, sift through in the next couple of years. And, I don't know the current situation, I'm not sure how long it can last. And, because the state of upheaval, of cultural upheaval that we're in right now, I think is extremely disorienting. I think the polarization is very concerning. There is this very real tendency more than ever to see people people on the other side politically as the enemy. I think that, on both sides, really, there's an amount of kind of paranoia and hysteria about, the other side that is extremely troubling. That's not very optimistic, is it? I think the good news, maybe, is that, maybe this is like a cleansing fire, so to speak. Maybe we're going to get through this, and hopefully we will get through this without a civil war. Hopefully, we can start relearning how to talk to each other. And I guess the good news is that a lot of the ideas that are being kind of thrown by the wayside are bad ideas that weren't really working. So, hopefully, we'll see. We'll see. Hopefully what will emerge from all this is a kind of more viable liberalism. And, by liberalism, I don't necessarily mean liberalism in the American sense. I think it's been kind of observed that both American liberalism and American conservatism are liberal in a way because, they're all kind of rooted in the idea of individual freedom, the idea of, personal autonomy, the idea of, the kind of free marketplace of ideas. And I think this is what we should be striving. I think the good scenario is that, between the polar opposites or, the horseshoe really of, authoritarian populism a la Trump on one side and authoritarian leftism, authoritarian progressivism on the other side, hopefully, both sane conservatives and sane liberals can agree on certain basic principles, such as, individual dignity, personal autonomy, not treating people according to labels, respecting diversity of ideas. So that's the good scenario. I think the good scenario is that, the sane left will reject, the intersectional social just cult, and the sane right will reject the populist Trump cult. And then we can come together to say, we have certain differences about things like the size of government. We have certain differences about, let's say, the criminal justice system. We have certain differences about foreign policy, but, we can all agree on these basic values of, individual dignity, of, treating people as individuals, respecting the free exchange and diversity of ideas. And, that's the good scenario. And it's happening in some corners of culture, and I think that's good. And, maybe we'll see more of that.
All right, good. And how can people find you online?
Oh, people can always find me on Twitter. I am Cathy Young 63. It's Cathy with a C. And I actually have a website that I haven't updated in ages. It's cathyyoung.net. And I really need to get that updated.
All right. Very good. Thanks for your time today. And thanks to listeners.
All right. Well, thank you.
Visit my website at stoicsolutionspodcast.com, where you can connect with me on social media, find past episodes, and join my Discord chat server for interactive discussion. Support my work by becoming a donor through Patreon or PayPal to receive special perks, using referral links in the Donate tab on my website, and sharing my content. Email me with your thoughts, justinvacula@gmail.com. Podcast music, used with permission, is brought to you by Phil Giordano's symphonic metal group Fairyland from their album Score to a New Beginning. John Bartmann offered free consultation and audio edits for episodes 51 through 63. Thanks to generous patrons and fans of this podcast who help support my work. Have a great day.